in the previous lecture, I had briefly introduced you to Redux. I had introduced several concepts about Redux. But again, to consolidate your understanding of Redux, what better way than to actually do an exercise where you apply these concepts and learn it by doing. So this is the start of our learning of Redux and how we can use Redux with our React application. Now, the next several exercises will see me using various aspects of Redux and updating our React application. Our first step is to update our React project to use Redux. So to do that, let's install Redux and React Redux into our React application project that we have been working on so far. So going to the terminal, at the prompt, type yarn add Redux at 3.7.2. That's the version that I'm using in this course. So we'll install Redux into our React project. And also, as we understood from the previous lecture, along with Redux, we also need React Redux to provide us with a way of connecting our React application to Redux. So at the prompt, type yarn add React Redux at 5.0.7. And so that's the version that I'm going to be using in the project. Now, you can also do npm install, as I have mentioned several times before. So now that we have installed Redux and React Redux into our project, it's time to go and update our application. Going to the application in the Visual Studio Code here, the first thing that I'm going to do is in the source folder, I'm going to create a new folder and name it as Redux. As you would expect, all Redux related code, I will capture it into this Redux folder. Now within this Redux folder, the first step, I'm going to create a reducer function there. So to do that, let's create a file named reducer.js in the Redux folder. Now, the reducer.js file is where I will implement my reducer function. So as you recall from the lecture, the reducer function is a pure function. So how do we implement that? Now, I will also need to update the main component to make use of Redux. So let me go to the main component and I'm going to cut out these from the main component. So the dishes, comments, leaders, and so on, I'll cut it out from the main component because my main component will now obtain the state from my Redux store. So and move all that into Reducer because this is where we will set up our state. So dishes, comments, leaders, and promotions, I have moved them into reducer.js file. Now, in addition, before I set up the reducer function, let me create a constant named initial state. This is nothing but a JavaScript object here, initial state. Now, how do I initialize this initial state? Now, this would contain exactly the same structure as the state that you see in your main component. So I'm going to remove the state from the main component because I will no longer need that there, and then move that whole thing into this initial state here. Again, going to the main component, I'm going to remove the state from the main component completely because I won't need that there anymore. So you notice that I am simultaneously updating main component and reducer.js. So now what this is specifying is this is the initial configuration for my state. Now later on you will see me updating this in a bit more detail as we go through the exercises. Now to create our first reducer function, we will export the reducer from here. So we'll say export const reducer. So this is the reducer function that I'm going to create. What is this reducer function? This reducer function is going to receive the current state and then an action. So as you recall, to generate the next state, we need the current state and an action. So these are the two parameters my reducer function is going to receive. And this, as I said, is a pure function. And so I cannot modify the state directly here in the reducer. I can only do an immutable change and then return an updated version of the state from this reducer. So that is what the reducer function's job is. Now, at this moment, I don't have anything to do because I haven't implemented any actions. So what I'm going to do is, as a default, I will just return the state. So I am not modifying the state in any way. So I'm just returning the current state from the reducer function. This is good enough to get started in this exercise. We need to set up the reducer function because our store needs to know what to do when an action is dispatched to it. So that's the way we set up our reducer function. Now, also, we will make use of the ES6 way of specifying a default value for a parameter. Now, when the reducer is called initially, at the start of your application, your state will be uninitialized. Now, when your application is started, you want to initialize your state to the initial state that we have just specified earlier. What is this initial state? This initial state contains 4 properties: dishes, comments, promotions, and leaders. We have seen why we need these in our application. So what I'm going to do is I will make use of the ES6 way of defining functions where you can specify the default value for a parameter, and then I'll say state equal to initial state. So when the reducer is first called by my store would have no state. So the state will be uninitialized. So it will be undefined there. So in order to avoid issues with that, I'm going to say that if the state is undefined, the default value will be initial state, which I have just defined earlier. So that is what I'm going to be supplying to my reducer function here. So this reducer function right now, it is not doing anything. It is just returning the state as is because I haven't defined any action. So I'm just going to return the state as is. And that is good enough. This is a pure function here. It is not changing the state in any way. So it is just returning the current state as is as a starting point. Now that we have created the reducer function, let's also configure our store here. So I'm going to introduce another file here named configure store.js. Now this is just convenience. You don't have to do it this way, but I find it convenient to do the store configuration in a specific file and then export that from there. So this is just my way of doing it. You would see examples of use of Redux where they don't necessarily follow this approach. Again, as I mentioned, the create store is made available from Redux. So I'm going to import the create store from Redux. What does create store allow me to do? It allows me to create the Redux store. And then also let me import the reducer and initial state. Now I have exported both of these from the reducer.js file that I've just implemented earlier. Now why do I need these? Because I need these to configure our store. And then from here I will export a function named configure store. Now this configure store function is required because that is how I'm going to configure my store. Now where do I configure my store? We'll come to that in a short while. Now when you configure a store, you will need to create the store here. So we'll say const store equal to, we have just imported this create store here, so we'll say create store. Now this create store itself takes two parameters here. So as you see, the create store takes a reducer and also some other parameters, and then an initial state if required. Okay, so that's the two parameters that this store takes. So in the create store here, I'm going to supply those two parameters to my store here. So this is how you create a store or Redux store in your application. So reducer, and then I will supply the initial state as the two parameters to my create store. And then from this function configure store, I'm going to return the store that I have just created. So when somebody calls this configure store, it will configure my my Redux store. So that's the purpose of this function that I've just implemented here. Again, as I said, this is just a pattern that I follow, and you don't necessarily have to follow this pattern, but I find this convenient to use this approach for implementing my application. Now that we have created the Redux store, or rather we have at least have a function that enables us to create the Redux store, let's update our application to make use of this store. So to do that, we will go into the app.js file. In the app.js file, I'm going to import the provider. Recall I mentioned about the provider in the lecture. This provider component I import from Redux, from React Redux. So the provider is part of React Redux. Now this provider component allows me to configure my React application so that the Redux store becomes available to all components in my application. Also, I will import configure store, the configure store function that I've just implemented earlier, from, where do I have that? In the Redux folder, in the configure store.js file there. So I import that from the configure store, and then I need to configure my application. So here I'll say const store configure store. So when I call I need to define this here, const store configure store. So now my store becomes available to me now. So within my render function, I will surround this with provider, and this provider, as I said, takes one attribute, which is the store attribute, where I supply the store that I've just created here as the parameter to my application. So I need to surround my React application with this provider here. That's it. So when I do this, my store, React store, becomes available to all the components within my React application. So that's the change that I need to make to the app.js file. Now, the last step is to make use of the connect from React Redux to connect my React application to the Redux store. So that we do in the main component. So we'll go into the main component, and within the main component, if we are making use of the React router, we also need to import this with router from React router DOM, because that will be required for configuring my React component to connect to Redux. So we'll say with router, that is required from there. And then I will also import connect from React Redux. So as you saw, the connect method is available from React Redux. So once I obtain the connect from React Redux, so how do I connect my main component? So because this is the component where I was earlier holding the state of my application. Now this main component needs to go and obtain that state from the Redux store. So to do that, I need to connect this component to my Redux store. Before I connect this component to my Redux store, I also need to define the map state to props function, which obtains the state as a parameter here. Now this function that I defined here, map state to props function, again, let me define that outside the class there. This map state to props function will then return. What this does is that this will map the Redux store's state into props that will become available to my component. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to map all the state. Recall how we defined the state for my main component. We had 4 properties within that state, dishes. Now this dishes will become available from my Redux store's state here. So this state that I am obtaining here is the state from my Redux store. So from the state, recall how we defined the state. If you go into the reducer, so you saw that the initial state was defined with 4 properties: dishes, comments, promotions, leaders. We need access to these 4 within my main component. So in my main component, I am mapping each one of them into properties that become now available to my main component. So I'll say dishes state dishes, then we'll say comments state comments. Again, don't forget the comma there. Then we'll say promotions state promotions, and then leaders state leaders. So these 4 now will become available as props to my main component. How do they become available as props to my main component? These are derived from the Redux stores by connecting this component to the Redux store. So how do we connect this component to the Redux store? Now, to connect the component to the Redux store, we'll go down here and then we will wrap this main that we define here inside a connect. So let's surround this main by parenthesis, and then we will enclose this inside one more parenthesis, and then here we'll say connect, and connect takes map state to props as one of the parameters here. This map state to props, we have just defined that function earlier. So that is supplied as, again, it also takes another one called maps dispatch to state here. So again, you can see what map state to props is supplying for us. And it also takes map dispatch to props. Right now, I don't have any dispatch related properties available. So that's why I'm not supplying that here. But in a later exercise, we will introduce that here. Now, if you are using the React router, then in order to make this work, you need to surround this with inside the with router. So now you see why I imported with router from React router DOM. So this is how you will end up connecting your component to the React router. So once we are done with this, then we go into our main components class definition. Inside this main component, all the Redux state becomes available as props, hence the name map state to props. So whatever we were using as this state here will have to be changed to this props, because the props will come in as properties for the main component because we defined it this way and then connected the main component to my Redux store. So everywhere you see this dot state, you change that to this dot props. So remember to go through your entire code in the main component and then update every one of them this dot props dot dishes. So dish with ID needs to be updated. And then do I see the this dot state anywhere? Okay, there and then there. I think that's about it. Now, one easy way for me to make sure is let me search for this dot state within this file, and I don't notice any this dot state anymore in this file. So that means that I have completed all the updates. So once I have done this, let's save all the changes that we have made and then go and take a look at our application. Going to the application in the browser, you see that my application is working just like before. About us, menu, dishes, contact us, every one of these is working just like before, and back to the home component. So now you see that we have updated our React application to make use of Redux behind the scenes to store the state of our application, and then connected our main component to the Redux store so that the main component obtains its state information from the Redux store for our React application. With this, we complete this exercise. In this exercise, we have taken our first steps to bring Redux into our React application and then connect our React application with Redux, and then make use of the Redux store for storing the state of our application and then obtaining the state into our React application using React Redux. This is a good time for you to do a git commit with the message intro to Redux.